So we knew there were going to be some changes to hit rolls and modifiers in 9th edition, and now we have the full rule. It looks like the sun has finally set on the day of the Alatok Eldar Flyer. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we've been going through the 9th edition news as Games Workshop has been revealing it to us. Today we're going to be looking at another previewed rule from the core rules of the game. This one again came out through a Tau Warhammer community preview post, unsurprisingly talking about the effects of firepower in the game, and it's basically some clarification on the ways that modifiers are changing in 9th. So let's take a look and talk about the changes that it might mean for the game. So in brief, the rule is this: as before, unmodified hit rolls of 1 will always fail, but now unmodified hit rolls of 6 will always hit, which to be honest is a bit of a minor change, particularly when taking into account the second part of the rule, but it does mean if for whatever reason you had a ballistic skill or weapon skill of 6 and you suffer a -1 penalty, then you'll still be hitting on that 6. The really big change to the rule though is that now modifiers to hit rolls never get any better or worse than plus or -1. Basically, say if you're shooting at a unit that has multiple stacking -1 to hit rules, say for probably the most common example, you're shooting at an Eldar Flyer that also has the Alatok special rule, and has also used a stratagem such as lightning fast reactions. You get a -1 to hit roll with your guns for shooting at a Flyer. If you're targeting it greater than 12 inches away, then you'd have another -1 to hit because of the Alatok Craft World attribute. And if the Eldar player also uses lightning fast reactions, then it's going to be -3 to hit, because that also gives you a -1 to hit him. Basically, once you've taken all modifiers to hit, whether they're positive or negative, into account, if the total will be worse than plus or -1, then it's reduced to that number. That Alatok Flyer will now be a -1 to hit, and unless the model firing at it has something like a +1 to hit special rule, then there's going to be no value at having those successive -1s to hit on top of it. As of yet, there's no indication that this will apply to any other rolls in the game besides hit rolls. I strongly suspect it will work the same in melee, but there's no indication that this will apply to wound rolls unless they've chosen to phrase it in the same way. I'm genuinely unsure as to whether or not they would put the same restrictions on wound rolls. In general, negative to wound rolls are really rare, they're strong when they crop up, but I don't know if any armies can actually stack 2 negative to wound roll rules on the same thing. If this rule did come into effect to apply to wound rolls as well, it'd be more of an issue for positive to wound roll modifiers, as there are some combinations of psychic powers and stratagems and things that could give you multiple stacking +1 to wound benefits. In any case, I think that's something that we're going to have to wait to find out until we actually get our hands on the book. So what changes does this mean for the game at large then? Firstly, I would stress that there's still very good value in having -1 to hit. It's a really powerful defensive rule, and still does an absolute ton to screw over armies that have a ballistic skill of 4+. You drop their damage output by a third by having this rule. Craft World attributes such as Alatok, Styges 8 for AdMech, Alpha Legion for Chaos, or Raven Guard for Space Marines are still very powerful. The only change is that there's now no added benefit to taking units that already have an extra -1 to hit inbuilt in those armies. In general, these units have the cost of that upgrade factored into their things, so I'd imagine in general we're not going to see these units use units or abilities that grant you this extra -1 to hit, as there's just no point in it. Popular combos were the Eldar Flyers, as we mentioned, for Alatok, also their Rangers, which is a bit of a shame that they can't get -2 to hit, as it is after all what Alatok are known for, and it means that Rangers are now just as good in other craft worlds. Stages will have less value in using things like Sindonian Dragoons, although admittedly they can still move them very far with their pre-game stratagem. Alpha Legion had various combos where you could get massive stacking -1 to hit modifiers on certain things, such as Possessed Bombs or Lord Discordance for example, where you could soup up the same model both by having the Legion trait, or maybe a Warlord trait, and then stacking on a -1 to hit via psychic powers, or using a prayer from a Dark Apostle. Harlequin Skyweavers as well have a -1 to hit. There's no point in giving them lightning fast reactions anymore, as it won't do you any favours. Technically, these things will still have some purpose, say if you're fighting against an enemy that has a +1 to hit from something, say a Tech Marine with the Master of Machines ability next to some Space Marine tanks, but in reality these examples are fairly few and far between within the 40k universe. Basically, rather than seeing layered defensive buffs due to multiple -1s to hit, I think we're now going to see things like command points and stratagems invested elsewhere. If you want to layer up a unit's defense, then you're going to have to do it by other means. Things like stratagems that reduce the impact of damage on the unit, whether that's through feel no pain type saves, or being -1 to the damage rolls or something like that. You can still make things very tanky, including many of the examples that we've already talked about, but other ways will have to be found. In some cases this won't even be a bad thing. Say if you have invested loads of points in making a certain unit -3 to hit in the shooting phase, and then you face an all melee army, you've essentially wasted a lot of points and abilities by making them go that far. If you layer the defense in other ways, then it might be a little bit better against the field. Losing the ability though is a nerf, don't get me wrong. In particular, this rule is really quite a big nerf to units that have an innate -2 to hit. I'm afraid I can't think of all that many throughout the 40k universe. I'm sure there's more, but the Vindicare assassin in cover with his stealth suit springs to mind. Typically he's -2 to hit against shooting attacks, and the Tau Ghost Kill with its drones nearby also gets a -2 to hit under normal circumstances. If Games Workshop still wants these guys to be similarly tough, they're going to have to find other ways to do so. If you look at it from the perspective of the people shooting at these stacked -1 to hit monstrosities, it is in general going to be a decent buff to shooting, particularly things like Ballistic Skill 4+ armies, who while they're hit very hard by one single -1 to hit, they're hit even harder by -2, only hitting on 6s. In general, if you were investing in things to be better against multiple stacked -1s to hit, say using a combination of a Chapter Master and a Tech Marine with Master of the Machines for your Space Marine vehicles, that amount of coverage isn't going to be anywhere near as necessary now. Against these -1 targets, you can generally get by with one or the other now. An interesting quirk of the rule seems to be that infantry moving heavy weapons usually get a -1 to hit penalty. If they know they're going to be firing it against a -1 to hit target, then they just may as well move anyway now. It can't get worse than a -1, so what's the harm in taking another -1 penalty? By moving the weapon, you may as well get the mobility, and get to position them optimally in whatever way you see fit. Finally, of course, the flip side of this rule does mean that you won't be able to stack multiple +1 to hit modifiers, which will be relevant in some cases. Again, multiple stacking +1 to hit rules didn't tend to be all that prevalent, but there's a couple of edge cases where they could certainly apply. For example, say something like a Cadian Hydra in the Imperial Guard, who gets +1 to hit against a unit with fly. If the unit with fly doesn't have any sort of minuses going on, then that Hydra wouldn't get anything extra from, say, using overlapping fields of fire, the Cadian stratagem that gives it +1 to hit as well. Despite the combination of those two rules, it's still going to be hitting on 3s. However, of course, the two could certainly be useful if you're taking aim at a flyer or something with a -1 to hit, as that would make the difference between hitting on 3s or hitting on 4s. Now, pretty much every army had at least one unit with a -1 to hit of some sort, and a lot of those could also combine to make a -2 somehow. I've listed a few examples here, but if you can think of anything else that's particularly relevant to the game, then please let me know down in the comments below, particularly if there are any strong units that you think are going to be significantly impaired now. Overall, myself, I feel broadly positive about the change. While in some cases it may fit the fluff to be almost impossible to hit certain units, I think from a gameplay point of view I generally prefer things that do allow you to interact with other units. I just find it makes it more interesting than if you're, say, playing an entire plain army, and knowing that the vast majority of your firepower is going to be completely worthless if you were playing a Ballistic Skill 4 army, such as the Guard for example. It is a little bit of a clunky restriction, to be honest, and it certainly hits some things harder than others, and some things that didn't need as much doing about them, as well as others that potentially did. Going forward though, with books being written as this as a fact of life, I do think that it will be broadly a positive change for the future, and I stress that having a -1 to hit is still a very powerful defensive upgrade. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where we'll be taking a look at any of the other previewed 9th edition rules, one by one as Games Workshop gives them to us. If you've been enjoying my videos recently and would like to support the channel, I'd just like to mention the Auspex Tactics Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description below. The Patreon is what allows me to focus on making these videos, as opposed to picking up shifts in my regular job. So if you have been enjoying these, then any support is greatly appreciated. Channel patrons get to see videos early each week, there's regular polls to see what sort of videos come next on the channel, and there's monthly prize draws where I give away some miniatures, next month being 3 copies of the Indomitus box. If any of that sounds interesting to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then you can find the link down in the video description below, and a massive thank you to all of the supporters for allowing this channel to happen. In any case, thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.